Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Kevin Remdy, IT Pro Evangelist for the Microsoft Corporation. Kevin, you now have the floor.
All right, thanks very much. Well, greetings and welcome everybody to today's webcast. I'm really excited about this one because as an IT Pro Evangelist and as a former Exchange Administrator in particular, this is wonderful news because we have some great new functionality in this newer version of Exchange Server 2007 with regard to disaster recovery. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Kevin Remdy, and I'm an IT Pro Evangelist with Microsoft. I put my email address and my blog address on this page for you, so if you have any additional questions after the webcast, you're unable to find the answers online, feel free to send me an email. I'll get those answers to you. And I also want to note that I put a resource page on my blog, and in fact I put it up today, specifically for this webcast. So those of you that are watching it live here, well, if you have a question, you might be able to find the resources there. If you are watching this in a recorded fashion sometime later, then you're certainly welcome to go to the blog and find the resources as well. In fact, I put the permanent link, the permalink, to that resource page on the for more information slide toward the end of the webcast today. So you can all take advantage of those resources. All right, so let's get into it. What are we going to cover today? Well, we're talking about disaster recovery. And of course, we all want to understand how to better plan for disaster recovery, to be ready for disaster. We need to understand the kind of things that can go wrong in our Exchange servers and in the information they store and the information they store and that they handle. So we really need to look at each of the new server roles in Exchange 2007. We need to know what each role does, and then what could happen to our organization if one of those roles fails. Now, of course, it's important in our organizations, right? Is email important? Absolutely. You couldn't say that necessarily 10 years ago, but today email has become a critical application. You can no longer wait until a problem occurs before you fix it. So during this session, we're going to talk about what you can do to avoid problems in the first place, avoiding disasters, things such as planning redundancy into your organization, providing yourselves adequate backup, implementing fault tolerance. And when we do have a disaster, well, you'll need to get the server up and running as quickly as possible. So during the session, we're also going to look at some recovery solutions and some tools that you have available to you. So at the end of the day today, we're going to run through a number of demonstrations, and we're actually going to show some of these fault-tolerant features and recovery tools in action. Now we have, as we do in every webcast, a slide here listing some helpful experience. So this is just some technology that hopefully you have a little bit of experience in and understand some of the concepts around in order to get the most out of this session. Now we do go a little deeper today. This is a level 300 session today. So we're going to actually show you, as I mentioned, some of the tools, some of the functionality, moving databases around and so on. All right, so here's our agenda. We have 4 main points that we're going to cover today. We're going to start out by discussing the Exchange server roles and what they do. This is going to help us understand the impact of a server failure on our messaging infrastructure. So actually, before we really get into the meat of the system, I do want to talk a little bit about the goals for Exchange Server 2007, because as email systems have evolved and become more powerful, they certainly have become more complex, and they've become harder to manage. Our users need access to their mailboxes, not just when they're sitting at their desk, but from anywhere, and not just from computers, but from a variety of devices. So it's very important for our organization that email is not compromised, that our security is solid, that our email is available, that any availability problems are going to have serious detrimental effects on our organization. Now, previous versions of Exchange ran on 32-bit operating systems. We had 32-bit operating systems limiting what we could do with memory, right? We only have 4 gig of addressable memory in a 32-bit operating system. And so that actually leads to poor performance. And with Exchange 2007, of course, we went to the 64-bit versions of Windows Server 2003 as the foundation. So with the 64-bit operating system, now we have very large amounts of addressable memory. And that extra memory allows us to have larger mailboxes, larger mailbox databases, certainly improving performance, but think of the other side of it. Larger mailbox databases and data stores means more things to go wrong, more data that can be lost. And so we've put in some new mechanisms to improve how we protect our data. We're going to talk about some of those in this session today. In particular, some of the things around local continuous replication and clustered continuous replication. We also have enhanced, so we've enhanced server availability in those regards. And around enhanced security, we have smart screen technology. We have Exchange Server better able to determine what is legitimate email versus unsolicited commercial email or other spam and unwanted messages. So good improvements all around. Big goals for Exchange 2007. So again, first item on our agenda, we really need to understand the roles and what each of those roles do for us in our Exchange environment. So let's talk about that. Let's run through some of the basics here. The server roles that we have in Exchange fall into two broad categories. Really, we have roles that are addressed at the perimeter, a role at the perimeter in the form of the Edge Transport Server, and then we have 4 roles on our internal network. Now, I won't go into great detail about all these roles and what they do. It's pretty clear from what the names are. And anyway, this isn't supposed to be a introduction to Exchange Server 2000 session. We're actually going to talk about how to recover these roles and maintain these roles. But suffice to say that in our environments, we do have these roles to consider. A client access role for the sake of all non-Outlook access, so access to Outlook web access, or Exchange Anywhere, which is RPC over HTTP, or well, that's really Outlook Anywhere. Exchange ActiveSync, which is our mobile devices and so on, going through the client access server. Hub transport and edge transport on the perimeter, hub transport internally, having to do with routing of messages and making the connections for that secure transport. Mailbox role, well, that's the database, right? That's where our data stores are located. And then the unified messaging role. We have this new role in Exchange 2007 that supports inbound faxes and inbound voicemails. So we're getting our voicemail now into our mailbox and unifying that whole messaging experience. So a typical message flow in an organization looks a little something like this. Here we have the outside world. We have other SMTP servers here sending into our Edge Transport Server. And see, I jumped ahead. We only had one slide for this. I thought this was going to be a building slide, but anyway, here we go. So we got the other transport servers, other SMTP servers sending into our Edge Transport Server, where initial routing and hygiene happen. The Edge Transport Server actually has a secure tunnel then for inbound messages to the Hub Transport Server, or a Hub Transport Server, and that's where internal routing takes place, as well as the application of policy. Once it's routed on down to the appropriate mailbox, well, of course, that's going to be on the mailbox server. And then on the mailbox server, our full Outlook clients can access their mailboxes internally. But if it's some other kind of access, such as, again, Outlook Anywhere, Outlook Web Access, other protocols, and so on, those are going to be accessed through the client access server role. That's where all the other clients can grab hold of their email. And, of course, this other role here that we talked about, unified messaging, giving us the ability to do voicemail and email over our mailbox. Okay, so now that we know what the roles are, quick overview of what the roles are in our Exchange organization, we really need to know how and what we need to protect with regard to those. So let's talk about server installations. Now, whatever role or roles you have installed on a particular Exchange server, and you can have in those internal roles, you can have more than one role installed. In fact, you can put all roles on one server. But no matter what you have installed, they all have something in common, and that is the fact that they are servers. So they have Exchange executables. They have the binaries that are installed in the program files folder. And, of course, if these files are damaged, then Exchange can't function. Another thing to remember is that there is some local configuration that happens when you install a server role. So the configuration is typically stored in the registry, so it's stored in the registry in the server. There is other configuration information that's stored in the Active Directory. Now, in both cases, it is important that you want to keep that information safe and be able to recover it should you need to. Now, by performing system state backups really is the best way to back up both the binaries and any local registry settings or any other localized configuration. So you can use any appropriate backup and restore method that suits you as long as you remember to do the backup of the system state on the servers that you want to recover. Now, what about Exchange configuration information? What does this configuration data, where does it exist? So aside from the local registry, the other local configuration data, we have data that's saved in the Active Directory, as I mentioned. Specifically, Active Directory is actually where you're going to find the configuration information for your servers that support unified messaging, hub transport, client access, and the mailbox server role. So pretty much every role other than that external role, the one that's on the outside of the firewall, the edge transport. Because the edge transport server is a little bit different. It isn't installed on a domain-joined machine. So what it's using is actually Active Directory Application Mode, or ADAM, and that's installed locally on the edge server. So this is where it's going to keep that configuration information for the edge server. Now, I got to be clear about this. To enable the edge server to pass messages to the appropriate hub server, the edge is going to require some recipient information. And that information is actually sent from a hub transport server to the edge, and it's stored in the edge server in an instance of ADAM, as I mentioned. And it's made available from the hub server over LDAP port 1389, and it's read-only at the edge. So you can determine how much information to provide in this way at the edge. The edge transport server ADAM is kept up to date using an edge sync. That's a synchronization tool. It's a subset of Active Directory recipient information that is actually made available then to the edge server. Along with the recipient data, there is some organizational and routing data, and that's going to have to be sent also. ADAM is going to run in as a non-operating system service, and because of that, it doesn't require deployment on a domain controller. It doesn't need access to a domain controller. So the main benefit is it's running as a user service, is that there are no domain controllers required at the edge. And this is a big security benefit, right? That's the whole idea behind having this server away from our domain, is that there's a better security protection. You can find out more about ADAM at the Microsoft Windows Server 2003 website. So now, how do we protect our server configuration? Well, again, we need to back up both Active Directory and the subset of Active Directory information that we've made available at the edge. So if we are backing up our domain controllers and doing a system state backup on those, well, great. We are backing up Active Directory at that point too. So that's good. Active Directory, remember this, Active Directory is a multi-master replicated database. So you do have multiple copies already existing, one copy installed on each domain controller that you're deploying. So that fact alone actually does allow you for some easier recovery. But you really still should perform regular backups of your Active Directory. Now again, going back to our discussion of Edge Server. To back up the Edge configuration, you're going to use the export edge config shell script. That's export edge config. And that's going to ensure that you have the ADAM information protected. It's worth noting that you can use that same shell script to create an installation source for an additional edge server that you want to deploy. So essentially, you're exporting the configuration that you can then import into a new server. It's a big time saver when you're deploying multiple front-end servers, multiple edge servers. We'll talk about a little bit more about front-end load balancing a little bit later during today's session. Now, of course, this is an important item to consider, right? Our email data. Exchange is, after all, an email product, so that's the main thing that people want protected, our user data. That's our precious email. Now, that data actually does exist in a couple of very important locations. The first location is in any SMTP queue. So as messages are moving through your organization, they're passing through the edge and from the internet and then through a hub transport server. They do pass through dynamically created queues. In fact, even messages from users that are homed on the same mailbox server are processed in the same way by the hub transport server, even if the hub role is deployed on that same server as the mailbox role. So the hub is still going to be involved. The second location for user data is, of course, the mailbox database. And when a hub transport server determines the home database for the recipient object, well, then the message is stored in the mailbox database. Thirdly, user data might reside in public folders. Now, if your organization is relying on a public folder infrastructure, maybe you're supporting legacy applications or supporting free busy calendar information for older Outlook clients, then there is some user data being stored in these public folders. Now, a message queue, let's talk about queues for a second. These queues are created and deleted as necessary in order to support message flow. So you really need to consider that that data is transient. And because of that, there really isn't any way to back up that data. So in the event that a server fails and there's items in the queue, you really have to just consider those items unrecoverable from that server computer. Now, recovery might be possible from elsewhere, depending upon circumstances and configuration. We'll talk about some more about the transient data types later. But the most obvious way to protect your mailbox databases and public folders is to perform regular backup operations. So you can then perform restores to recover any lost or damaged databases. And we're going to focus on the specifics of mailbox database backup and recovery a little bit later in today's session. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how you might avoid some of the common problems that arise from server failure. And for that, we're going to talk about load balancing, clustering, and data replication. So in other words, we're talking about how you can prevent a failure. Well, think about this. Uh, are you going to be able to prevent a failure like a disk failure or a power supply failure from becoming a disaster? Well, I hope so. One possible solution is load balancing. Now, let's think about the perimeter for a second. This is where, we're deploying our edge servers. These servers don't contain any stateful data. And that means there's no data that really, no important data other than the configuration. There's no data, user data that resides on that server. So the best fault tolerance you can give to this role is load balancing. So it's very easy to do at the perimeter as well. All you need to do is install multiple edge servers with identical configurations. And then in the event of a single or even multiple server failures, you can be sure that some edge servers are going to remain to be able to service internet mail. Now, that of course assumes that you have load balancing configured properly for the inbound messages. Now, a big side benefit here is that you're going to have also enhanced performance, right? You have busy environments, more servers, of course, equals more simultaneous requests that can be handled. So your throughput is going to improve at the edge. Now, if you're a smaller business, you can't afford multiple servers at the edge, or maybe you're not even planning to implement edge servers, then you really should consider using a third-party hosting service that offers the services that are provided by the edge server. And I'll actually talk about a service that's available to you a little bit later in today's session. So that's some server load balancing. Now, as we move inside of our firewall on our local network, well, both the client access and hub transport roles already support load balancing. And you know what? They do it automatically. It's as easy as creating another client access server and another hub transport server in every Active Directory site. And at that point, load balancing is established for you automatically. Now, I do have another important note, though, with regard to the client access server role. This role does provide services available via the internet, right? We need access from the internet to that role. So the services on that server do need to be made available somehow. What you're going to want to do is you'll publish these services using ISA server 2006, or some other secure application publishing, essentially reverse proxying. Now, we won't go into the precise details here, but clearly you're going to need to ensure that sufficient resilience exists for your ISA servers as well. Otherwise, the client access services won't be accessible in the event of the ISA server failing. And ISA is going to reside in the perimeter network as well. Now, finally, the mailbox server. And here, you're going to definitely need to consider some kind of fault tolerance for that role. The data on the mailbox server is considered stateful, so it's not really suited for load balancing. Each server has different data, essentially, and users are going to connect to their own specific server where the mailbox resides. Now, let's talk about two possible solutions to the problem of having high availability on our mailbox server role. Let's think about the database world. A number of you probably worked in databases for a while, and you understand the whole concept of how database transactions work. But for those of you that don't, let me talk about this for a second. When a database transaction happens, and you can think of the Exchange mailbox database as just another database in this case, transactions are written to a log file first, and then those log files transactions are then committed to the database. Now, the benefit of that, of course, is that if we have a failure of the database, well, we can recover the database, and then we can play back the log files up to the point of failure so that we can actually bring our server back up and running to the point where things fail. Someone very smart somewhere decided, you know what, hey, if we're saving log information in this location, why don't we go ahead and at the same time save that log information into another location? And then we'll go ahead, as long as we have that copy of the logs, hey, you know what, let's play back those logs into another copy of the database. So that's what log shipping is. And all the best database products, including SQL Server from Microsoft, do that log shipping, allow that. And Microsoft SQL Server actually has a technology called mirroring, for mirroring databases that way. Well, we can do that now in Exchange Server 2007. It's wonderful. And we can do this in the form of local continuous replication. So with local continuous replication, we essentially have a copy of the data at the ready. It's being saved, in this case, on local continuous replication to typically another disk on the same server. Now, there's another availability option this gives us. We're also going to benefit because since we have this data always at the ready, we can rethink how we do our full backups. Performing a restore operation is a time-consuming process, and so if we can reduce the situations where we need to perform them, that's wonderful. In fact, you know what? The Exchange Product Group actually looked at the data around when and why restores are done, and they discovered that the most common reason for performing a restore was a disk drive failure. So, of course, all bearings in a disk drive are going to wear out eventually, so people are going to have to look to backup to recover. Well, no. If we have a local copy available, but it's on a separate disk, now we have the ability to recover quickly from a failure if my disk dies. So we've taken that most common scenario completely out of the picture with local continuous replication. Now, wait a minute. What about if it's not my disk, but it's my server that dies? Well, then we have something called clustered continuous replication. So the situation where the failures cause my server to become available, such as a power supply going out, well, if a power supply goes out, local databases copies aren't going to help. So clustered continuous replication is for two computers to support a complete failover scenario. So a complete server failure essentially then fails over to this passive node. The passive node having that copy of the logs being played back into a database and being made available. So it's designed so that you can also have these two servers at completely different locations. In fact, that's a huge benefit of clustered continuous replication. It's almost a geo-clustering solution. So it's a great benefit. Hey, and you know what? Another benefit of another copy of the database. Think about backup operations. If I perform a backup operation, why don't I just back up the standby database instead of the live one? So now I can reduce the performance impact on my production server or my production disk, and thereby, of course, reducing the impact on my users as well. Now, although LCR and CCR are going to reduce the likelihood of having to perform a restore operation after a disk failure, they also reduce the number of backups that really you would need to perform. But of course, and here's an important note, doing a backup of the standby database is going to require that you use some VSS solution, Volume Shadow Services solution. That's required for backing up the standby database. So it's going to be a solution that interoperates with the Windows Volume Shadow Services. And that's important to note because the current included backup tool in Windows Server, the NT Backup tool, does not integrate for the sake of Exchange Server, doesn't work with Windows Volume Shadow Services. So it's not good for, the only good thing about NT Backup is you can back up a live database with it, but it's not going to back up the standby. So you'll use some other product to do that. Okay, so let's review some of these technologies. We reduce the number of backup operations, and of course the cost of performing backups and maintaining archives is also reduced. And but we're always looking for ways to reduce costs, right? Well, local continuous replication can help us with that. It'll help us reduce the total cost of ownership of Exchange. It's impossible to guard against absolutely all forms of data loss, though. But of course, with LCR, we can protect against the most common one, which was the loss of a storage group through the underlying disk dying. And again, in this case, we wouldn't even have to perform a restore. We'd simply have to bring the standby copy online. So you may be still asking me, wait a minute, Kevin, what about backups? Well, backups are always going to be important. Don't get me wrong here. They're always good as another option for restoration, and also for the sake of archival, based on your own company's data retention policies. But backups do not provide fault tolerance. They only provide a means to recover data. So a system is only going to be fault tolerant if it can continue to operate after a failure. So with local continuous replication, that's how we can do it. Our server can continue to operate even if the disk fails, as long as you have everything in place, the log files and the correct disk configurations. They've always given you the ability to recover to a certain point of failure. But now with log shipping, we can achieve even a higher level of resilience. And, of course, more good news, being able to perform far fewer backups. So previously, if a disk failed, well, you'd need to replace it, perform the restore of the storage group, and then replay the logs since the last backup. But now, you don't need to do anything, at least not immediately. The system is still running. So let's summarize the benefits of clustered continuous replication and see how it's going to take reliability to the next level. Again, CCR has all the benefits of local continuous replication, but includes a few more. Because Exchange Server 2007 only supports active passive cluster configurations, in this case we have no single point of failure. So the cluster is more fault tolerant. And of course, the more reliable your message system is, the better. And let's not get this confused with Windows clustering. This is not a cluster in the shared storage device sense. So it's not shared storage clustering. Because of that, it doesn't impose any restrictions on the type of storage you use. If you're thinking about server hardware, well, the requirements for your server hardware are much less stringent in that regard. You don't have to select hardware from the cluster category in the Windows Server catalog. As long as the servers in the cluster, in the CCR cluster, are comparable, well, that's all you really need to worry about. Another benefit. With Exchange 2007, you can create a cluster that spans multiple data centers. And you can do that without the need for third-party software. Everything you need is already built into and included with Exchange. And it's also fairly easy to set up. It's a simple installation. The Exchange product group has unified the cluster installation process with the standard mailbox server role installation. So there's no specialized knowledge required. And any cluster-specific related management tasks are hidden underneath and the associated generic Exchange server management task. So here's an example. When you perform storage group reconfiguration, Exchange server automatically performs any related CCR management tasks, and it does it for you automatically. And finally, just like LCR, if you have this offline copy of the database, that means that we can actually use it to perform our backup. Okay, so let me show you a little bit now. We're going to do some demonstrations here. As Sarah mentioned, we're going to be going to full screen here, or to go to full screen so that you can see my application sharing, you can press F5, and you can use that to toggle back to the slides when you're ready. So let's do that. Go into the sharing here. Now, what you should be seeing here is my server, and I'm going to be doing much of this from two perspectives. One, I'm going to be doing it from the perspective of you, the Exchange administrator, and I'm also going to be doing it in the perspective of a guy named Spencer Lowe. Poor Spencer, his mailbox is going to be put through the ringer today. But we'll notice something here. I've actually launched a copy of the management shell, and I've done a get mailbox command on Spencer Lowe just to see that his mailbox is currently residing on this mailbox server, SMBEX01. And let me point out a little bit about our organization here as well. Notice we have two servers, and these both are actually running right now. I have two virtual machines running. One, SMBEX01, which has two storage groups, mailbox database and public folder database. And we have the EXBE, or backend 01, which is just a mailbox server, so it's not a client access or hub transport. It's just a mailbox server role, and that contains the one storage group with a mailbox database in it. Currently, all of my mailboxes reside on SMBEX01, including Spencer's. In fact, just to show you that, I'm going to open up Outlook Web Access. I'll open up only one instance of Outlook Web Access. There we go. And we'll log in as Spencer here, just to show you that Spencer does have data in his mailbox. He's well overdue for a sales lunch with Peter Houston. We can verify that he has a calendar as well that is populated. Got a pretty busy work week here. Oh, I'd love to be that busy. And so he has some data here. Now, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to simulate a failure, or actually, we're going to imagine a failure. I'm not actually going to bring the database down, but I'll show to you in the get mailbox command that we've actually done what we say we're doing here. Let's assume that SMBEX01 becomes unavailable. Okay, so what do I want to do? Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to provide dial tone. We'll talk about dial tone a little bit later in the slides here, but I just want to show you this example here. Dial tone means Spencer is currently he's right now he's dead. His mailbox server is dead. So what are we going to do? Well, he needs to get work done, right? So I'm going to bring up a server. Doesn't necessarily need to be my original server, although it could be. We could provide dial tone on that server as well. But it could be some other server. And very easily, what I'm going to do is move the configuration information for Spencer's mailbox over to another live mailbox database, even on a different server. So let's do that. Using the management shell here, I'm going to run a command called move mailbox. And don't get excited. We're not actually moving the mailbox, but I'll talk about that in a second. Let's finish the command here. I'm not good at typing and talking at the same time. And we're going to send it to the target database of EXBE01, mailbox database. And I'm not going to move the mailbox. I'm going to use the configuration only switch. Now the configuration only switch is a very powerful new functionality. Here's what it's doing. The assumption here is that Spencer's actual mailbox is on a dead server. So I don't have access to Spencer's mailbox. For all I know, that data is gone. Okay? But I need to give Spencer some dial tone. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling the Exchange organization, hey, move the configuration information over to this other database so that when Spencer comes online with either Outlook 2007 or Outlook Web Access, the auto configure for the Outlook client or just Outlook Web Access and its capability to know where the mailbox is found is going to automatically go to the proper mailbox server. So let's do that command. Take a second to pull the configuration information out of here. There we go. Let's give me a. You sure you want to do this? Yes. It didn't actually. Again, that original mailbox server might not be available. So all we're doing is really moving that configuration information in this case. So let's go ahead and prove that that's been done. I'm going to open up Outlook Web Access again. And remember, all we're giving Spencer is dial tone here. So while Spencer might be a little bit upset, notice actually it prompted me for the essentially new access to a new location. First time you go in, you have to tell it your time zone. So while Spencer doesn't have his data, at least he can get his work done. He's got dial tone into the Exchange organization, and he can start sending and receiving emails. So very easy to give him dial tone for this situation. Okay, that configuration only switch is very, very powerful. Okay, now let's talk about local continuous replication. Now I have in my organization here, in fact, let me open up a couple of Explorer windows. Here's my C drive. And in fact, I'm going to open up a new window on the Disk 1 folder here. So what I have in my organization is the program files, Microsoft, Exchange Server, and Mailbox. There's my first storage group. And here's the log files, Mailbox database, all in the default location. Okay. Now, what I want to do is have a copy of the log files and the database being replayed back into another location on a separate, different disk for the sake of this local continuous replication that we talked about. I'm actually going to put that under this extra disk that I've linked here. So I've got another hard disk, and I've got a DB and a logs folder all set up and ready to go for that. So how do I configure LCR? What kind of very, very difficult tasks do I need to perform to make that happen? Well, let me show you. Right now, currently, notice the copy status of the storage group is disabled. In fact, let me talk about that. In order to enable LCR, you only can have one database in the storage group. In fact, if you have more than one mailbox database in a storage group, you are not allowed or able to enable LCR. And that's just another reason why we recommend at Microsoft keeping one mailbox database per storage group. Now, you can have as many as 50 storage groups. Don't worry about that. But one mailbox database per storage group is recommended. So let's go ahead and just, it's real difficult, right-click and say Enable Local Continuous Replication. Now, I'm not done yet. There's a little bit of a wizard, but the wizard walks you right through it. Here's a summary of what you're doing here. Here's the ability to point to the system files and log file paths. So let's do that. Instead of the default location, what I want to do, I want to put it in that Disk 1. So in this case, that was the system files, right, the first one. So I'm going to put that there in that DB folder. And we'll do the same thing, although in this case, to the log folder for the log files. And we will click Next. And here's our local continuous replication Exchange database file path. So we also have to set that up. I'm going to put that, it's already actually pointing to that DB folder. So that's where I was putting the system files as well. So it's under Disk 1, DB. Click Next. Summary of our configuration, and I'll click Next or click Finish, and it's going to walk through the steps creating the mailbox database for the sake of the local copy, and then configuring that storage group and doing this move of the data and the move of the log files. So it's going to take a few seconds to complete. Just about done. There we go. Now, I didn't. The important note here: I did not interrupt anybody's work. Anybody still working on that mailbox database never really noticed anything happening. But notice when I click finish here, my copy status goes to healthy. My mailbox database is still here and it's still mounted. And check this out. Here, let's look and see. We're at letter A3 on the log files here in the original copy and in the production database. And on disk 1 and in logs, we're there as well. Notice A3 is the, if we were to have seen the most recent one created, that's there too. So the log files have been replicated. In fact, let me also show you the database. Notice it's about 59, let's say 59 meg. And they're going to be not exact, but they'll be very close. So what we say, 59 meg, and there's the mailbox database. Yeah, 59 meg. So copied over that copy of the database being maintained for us. In fact, just to show you, here I'm even as logged in as Spencer Lowe here. Let's send an email to somebody whose mailbox is on that in that mailbox database. So let's create a new, because remember, we moved Spencer's. He's actually in Delta on another server. But let's send an email to Claire. And Claire is going to get a test message. And we'll attach a file that is larger than a log file. In fact, I'm going to attach a file that's a 5 meg in size. So we should see 5 new log files show up when that message arrives in Claire's mailbox. Of course, I'm going to have some disk and network activity in here for a second. And let's go back into this logs folder here. We'll look at this one as well. Be patient, it'll come. You know what? Let's sort it by date modified. I'll move this over here so that we can see. It'd be nice to be able to see them both happen at the same time. There we go. Oh, we missed it. I was hoping to see this one happen and then the other one happen right away. But 5 new log files happening right then and also being copied into our local continuous replication copy. So excellent. We have it set up properly. All right, let's go ahead and close those guys. LCR in place. Now, if we ever have a failure of our initial copy, we could run a very simple command on the in the management console management shell, and we're going to be able to essentially connect to that local copy and make that one the production copy. Now, before we go to the slides for a little bit more here, I want to do one more thing. Close out web access here, and I need to perform a backup. But I'm going to perform a backup using a utility that's an internal tool. So, and I want to just launch it running right now before we go to the slides, because it does take a couple minutes to run. But this is actually running the betest.exe tool. It's a volume shadow copy utility that is going to allow me to take a snapshot of my mailbox database. So it actually will do a VSS-enabled copy, a backup of the database. There is actually a betest tool, for those of you that are interested in this, that's available as part of the VSS SDK. But this is the one I'm using here is actually an internal Exchange product version that will allow me to do this backup. So I'm going to launch this batch file that is going to then in turn launch betest. And it's going to, while that's running here, I'll just let that run. I'm going to show that eventually we're going to see our backup in this folder is where it's going to put it. But this is actually doing a backup of our copy. So it's going to our local, it's going to our LCR copy of our backup and doing that snapshot. So let's go to the slides. We'll come back to that in just a second and talk a little bit more about clustering. Now, obviously, we couldn't have a proper discussion about disaster recovery and redundant systems without covering Windows clustering. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with it, clustering is a configuration of 2 or more servers, and these servers are referred to as nodes, that access shared information. So in Exchange, of course, the shared information would be the mailbox databases and any associated resources. So if one of our servers or nodes fails, the remaining servers or nodes will take over those assigned tasks of the failed node. So the clustering solutions typically fall into 2 categories, one of two categories. So the first one is active configurations. So here we have two nodes, both with assigned tasks. And in the event of a node failure, the remaining node will start to perform the tasks of the failed node. Now, the name active implies that there's a node running and ready to go, but there still are some performance implications during the failover of the resources that need to be reassigned. But it does give us a big benefit in terms of performance during failover, and it really is the preferred solution for clustering based on Microsoft technologies. Now, the second is active-passive configuration. So we had active-active, now we have active-passive. And of course, in this case, as the name implies, we have one node which is always running and the other which is idle, or it's available as a redundant node. But it is ready to take over any of the assigned tasks of the failed member of the cluster. Now, the main benefit of clustering here is the high fault tolerance that you gain, especially when you're combining with other fault tolerance strategies at the component level. So things such as redundant disks, power supplies, and so on. Now, the downside of clustering is that it does require a significant investment in hardware. So it might be out of the budgetary scope for many of the smaller organizations out there. Single copy clusters provide a clustered solution for Exchange Server 2007. In SCC, we have a single copy of a storage group on storage media, and it's being shared between the nodes in a cluster. So it's similar to clustering in previous versions of Exchange, but there are some pretty big improvements here. Single copy Exchange clusters require the use of a shared nothing architecture. So in this architecture, although we have all the nodes in the cluster accessing the shared data, they can't access it at the same time. So for example, if you have a physical disk resource that's assigned to node 1 of a 2-node cluster, well then node 2 can't actually access that disk until node 1 is either taken offline or fails, or if the disk resource is moved to node 2 manually. Now, Windows communicates with resources in a cluster by using a resource DLL, dynamic link library. And Exchange 2007 actually provides its own custom resource DLL to communicate with the Windows Server cluster service. So communication between the cluster service and Exchange 2007 is customized and it provides then the Windows cluster functionality. Exchange 2007 uses Windows cluster groups to contain Exchange virtual servers in a cluster. So a clustered mailbox server is a Windows cluster group containing cluster resources. So things such as IP address, one or more physical disk resources, the Exchange system attendant resource, and other Exchange resources. Clustered mailbox servers include Windows cluster service resources such as IP address resources, network name resources, physical disk resources. Clustered mailbox servers also include their own Exchange-specific resources. So when creating a clustered mailbox server, Exchange automatically creates the other essential Exchange-related resources, things such as HTTP virtual server instances and the information store instance. Now here's the main thing to remember when you're planning to use single copy clusters. The nodes must share storage. So as you recall, shared storage is not a requirement of local continuous replication or clustered continuous replication. This is a requirement of single copy clusters. Also, the server computers themselves, again, they have to meet more stringent requirements. So for Exchange 2007 cluster nodes running on Windows Server 2003 Enterprise or Data Center editions, you really need to select your server hardware from the hardware list in the Windows Server catalog, and then you'll find it under the Cluster Solutions category. Now, of course, all the fault-tolerant strategies we talked about so far are going to benefit from additional component-based fault tolerance. Now, you need to think about your infrastructure. If something in your network infrastructure, maybe your routers or hubs, wiring perhaps, if they have problems, you can have serious service availability issues. So it's important to make sure that these basics are in place. You got to consider and minimize then all those single points of failure in your infrastructure. Now, Exchange Server is actually pretty smart when it comes to message routing. It doesn't require a routing group infrastructure to reroute in the event of infrastructure failures, but it does use the physical IP topology to determine the best route available. Now, what about power interruptions or power supplies? Well, the point is you need to take a look at your hardware and you need to ask yourself, if this component fails, what's going to be the impact? And once you've got that inventory down, you can start to work on mitigating the problem by providing that component redundancy. Now, of course, storage, that's a very important component, if not the most important one. So let's focus on storage considerations for a moment. Now, before we can detail the storage requirements for each of the server roles, we need to run through what you're going to find on a given server. The Windows Server 2003 operating system and its paging file, right? The Exchange database, that's made up of the transaction logs, the database itself, and the Exchange temp folder. Now, both the Exchange 2007 Edge Transport and Hub Transport server store mail in a special ESE database that's essentially the mail queues. Again, that's that transient data. So on the Hub Transport server, incoming mail from the Internet is converted to MAPI prior to getting delivered. And that content conversion actually happens in the temp folder, TMP folder. The minimum configuration to provide adequate availability is then to place the operating system, the temp folder, the paging file on a 2-disk RAID 1 volume. The transaction logs and the ESE database should be on another RAID 1 volume. Now, it's also worth noting that to improve performance, you can further separate these components. So, for example, the database could be placed on a separate volume from the transaction logs. And likewise, the TMP folder could be placed on a different volume from the paging file in the operating system. Now, the client access server, this is going to be sufficiently protected if you place the various elements on a single RAID 1 volume. However, for performance reasons, you might want to consider a separate RAID 1 volume to host the operating system, then another one for the paging file, logs, and the temp folder again. What about unified messaging? Well, that server should be similar to the client access server with regard to storage configuration. You get sufficient resilience with a single mirrored volume. But you need to remember that unified messaging fault tolerance actually is also provided by deploying additional unified messaging servers and then configuring that in the unified messaging services configuration. Now, what about the mailbox server and the operating system and paging file? These all should be placed on a single volume built on a 2-disk RAID 1 volume. The transaction logs should be placed on a RAID 1 volume, this time comprising 6 physical disks. For reliability as well as performance, the logs are placed on a different volume than the databases. So the ESE database should be placed on a RAID 10 array, so it has a maximum, or it really has a minimum of 20 disks. RAID 10 gives you the same fault tolerance as RAID 1, but significantly higher I/O is achieved when you're striping the mirrored segments. So again, the main thing is that if you consider component level failure, you need to consider component level failure as well as thinking about server level fault tolerance, and that will hopefully prevent you from having any failures becoming a disaster. So how are we feeling? Feeling better about what we know, what to protect, right? We know what to protect now, so everything's good. Well, don't get too comfortable just yet. Bad stuff can still happen. So no matter how good your fault-tolerant protection is, failures do and will occur. What you need to do now, of course, is to plan how you're going to resolve a failure before it becomes a disaster. So let's start by talking about the loss of a database. What if we lose a database? Well, it is possible, even though you have a storage group replica in LCR, for example, or CCR, you could still lose a database. Now, what if the database, for some reason, becomes corrupted? Well, LCR and CCR actually won't replicate corruption, so that's good. But if your organization is impacted by a virus, perhaps generating a lot of superfluous traffic and messages, causing database problems, well, LCR and CCR will replicate that. Because of that, it is important that you plan for that eventuality. And again, always perform regular backups. Think about it for a second. Exchange Server supports much larger mailbox databases now, so you need to think carefully about the frequency and type of mailbox database backup. Now, daily full backups, that can be a huge time consumer. That can impact performance as well. So you want to make sure that your ESE database and transaction logs are on different physical volumes, because if you lose a database, of course, you can recover the database from the last backup, and then the transaction logs can be replayed onto the database during server database mount. So by using replication, by performing the appropriate backups, by separating the databases from transaction logs, you can protect your databases against loss. Okay, what about if the server dies? Well, let's think about what happened when that happens. Careful planning, of course, is going to definitely help you here. So here's an example. If you ensure that every Active Directory site has a mailbox server also contains 2 client access servers and 2 hub transport servers, well, you've already achieved load balancing and failover support for the hub and the client access roles. Also, again, installing multiple edge transport servers in the perimeter is going to make sure that it'll help you make sure that you don't have any interruptions in internet mail routing. The mailbox server, well, again, consider clustering for protecting mailbox servers from machine loss. Unified messaging services, well, they can be protected if you configure multiple gateways on your PBX. So you can then you set up a hunt group so that if the gateway is offline, well, the PBX would find another one that's operational. And if the unified messaging server fails, well, you could configure multiple unified messaging servers in the Exchange site, and that would then handle requests in case one of them were to fail. Now, once any server has failed, it really is up to you to decide what to restore or whether to restore or simply rebuild that server. So do I want to restore that server, or am I simply going to just build it from scratch? Because it's not always necessary to do a restore. And here's an example. The hub transport server. Well, it's basically a routing engine. It's got routing information and other configuration that's stored in Active Directory. So you really don't need to expend any great deal of effort recovering that particular server. Just install a new one into your organization. That's all you need to do. Now, I need to make sure you're sitting down for this one, okay? You all have to be sitting down because what I'm going to say now is going to shock some of you. You may not even want or need to restore your mailbox server. Oh? I'll say it again so I'm clear. You may decide that it's easier to rebuild rather than to restore the server that handles the mailbox server role. Oh, wait a minute, Kevin. That server contains important user data. Don't I have to restore mailboxes to the server they were originally on? Ah, that was true in previous versions of Exchange. Exchange 2007, you won't necessarily need to recover mailboxes in place. We're going to see that shortly. Well, before I show you that, though, let's talk a little bit more about some other disasters that we really need to prepare for. What about our server's configuration data? Well, again, most configuration data for all but the edge servers is stored in Active Directory. As long as you back that up, well, then you're reasonably well protected. And whatever other local data exists in the server role, that can be backed up in the system state backup option. And as we saw earlier, you can export the edge server configuration and then use it to rebuild a new edge server. Now, only the mailbox server role supports clustering. So if you install your mailbox into a cluster, then that server, of course, is highly protected. But again, it's not invulnerable. So do consider what would happen if you lost all the nodes. What if it's the entire cluster goes down? What's the impact? Well, so long as you have adequate backup, you can still then rebuild the server. And ultimately, with some of the recovery tools we'll see shortly, you won't necessarily need to rebuild the server. You can simply shift the databases over to another server, and either rebuild one or over to a temporary one. Now, the worst case scenario, of course, must be the consideration of losing your entire data center. And yes, that's a horrible thing to consider, but if you break it down, it still does come down to the fundamentals. So understanding what data was held where. Where's the backup? What recovery options do we have to consider? What happens to the data that's waiting for delivery? Okay, so in this demonstration, we're actually going to move a database. I've performed the snapshot backup, so the VSS snapshot backup. We're going to take those files and we're going to just move them over to a new server. Yep, you heard me right. Just going to copy them right over to another server, and we're going to bring that online. And then we're going to use that configuration-only switch. We're going to use that to make sure that all of our users are then going to be addressing their mailboxes on that new server as well, similar to what we already have done with Spencer. So let's go to our application sharing here again. And let's see how our backup's doing. In fact, it looks like it's done, so that's good. Let's go ahead and, oh, that's not the backup window. The backup window already closed. It's still my shell. So let's go into the volume C, and notice what I've actually got a copy of. And again, this copied it from my disk 1, which is now saved it here as the backup. It's just a folder with the DB. So there's my mailbox database and my logs. So snapshot backup. Now, in order to get those files over there, first of all, let's go ahead and open up a folder on my other server. In fact, I'm going to open up the actual live mailbox location on that server. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. I'm going to go into unlock on program files and Microsoft Exchange server. And this is on the other server. Mailbox, first storage group, and there's the database that I'm essentially going to copy the files into. So I'm going to actually copy this mailbox data store into the mailbox database that I already have running on the other server, this mailbox database. Now, currently that database is mounted, so I need to dismount that first before I can actually do this. So let's use the dismount command. I can do that from here, or I can do that from the shell. I'll show you how it's done from the shell. Let's clear some of this out a little bit here. Okay, so let's do the dismount database. And of course, it's going to say, yes, do you want to do that? Yeah, I'll say yes. In fact, I should be able to refresh this, and we'll see that it's now dismounted, so that's good. And before I can copy information in, and this is very similar to previous versions of Exchange, we need to make sure that there's a flag that says we allow for a file restore to this database. And that's just a safety precaution. So I'm going to do the set mailbox database. And I'm going to set the flag allow file restore to true. There we go. Okay. So now, before I copy these over, we do want to clear out some of the old data. So I'm going to go to this this first storage group folder over on the other server, and I'm going to clear out the log files and the database file. Oops. Make sure we get all those. Delete, 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 delete. There we go. Gone. Okay. Now what? So we have no first storage group anymore. But let's do this. Let's just take the database and copy it over. And let's take the snapshot. And remember, this is a snapshot. Let's take the log files. Let's copy them over. And the configuration of this particular mailbox database was that all those files were in the same directory, so we'll copy them into all the same directory. So they're all there. And now, drum roll please, mount database. Hit enter. Boom. We mounted it. Did we mount it? Let's double check here. Let's refresh this. Sure enough, our mailbox database is mounted. Wait a minute, what did we mount? We mounted a copy of the database from one server. We just copied it over and mounted an entirely different Exchange server. There's nothing in, here's the point, there's nothing in the mailbox database that says it has to be on this server. Woohoo! There's much rejoicing. So, and that's wonderful. Now, let's think about this for a second. What have I done with Spencer's mailbox? Remember, Spencer had dial tone, only dial tone. Well, what I've just done is I've essentially taken a snapshot that actually had his mailbox from a previous mailbox database and installed it and mounted it on this other server. That other server is where he's already pointing. So he, because I've already done that configuration only switch, is able to log into his mailbox, and look at that. He has his information. But hold on, where is he? Again, let's show you. Get mailbox. He's on that second server. So he's up and live. Now nobody else currently that had their mailboxes restored on that second server is yet able to get at that mailbox. So what we need to do is similar to what we did for Spencer. We need to use that move mailbox with the configuration only command. Now how am I going to target all those mailboxes? Well, I can do a get mailbox command, and I can essentially get all mailboxes, but then select. So say the where object and then the criteria. So let's say for each object that has a server name equal, so all the mailboxes on my original server, and let's just see what the result of that is. Okay, so there's the people that have mailboxes on the original server. And I can say, pipe that to the move mailbox. And again, target database is going to be the new one, the second server. With the configuration only command, right? Because remember, their mail is already on that server. It's just a matter now of making sure that their Outlook clients, the Outlook Web Access, all knows to go to this other server for their mailboxes. And I'm going to do this for all of those resulting. So I can say A for yes to all. And now every one of those users, next time they log into Outlook or Outlook Web Access, are going to automatically find their mailboxes there and recovered on that other server. Wonderful. Now, I'll tell you what. Let's fail again. I've actually created a backup. I did a streaming backup using NT Backup a couple days ago. And I'm going to show a failure now, and we're going to actually recover to a recovery storage group in our next demonstration. So to simulate our failure, I'm going to go to my other server, the server that has all those mailboxes that are currently loaded and running, and I'm simply going to shut it down. Bye-bye. Okay. So now, what are we going to do about all those mailboxes that are that are missing? Well, let's do something about that. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about some of these disaster recovery tools. Because again, that's essentially what we've had now. We've had a disaster. We need to recover. Now, this is of special interest. I want to talk about this page for a second because this one is very important for small and mid-sized organizations that want the protection of a clean message stream. They want the safety of a disaster recovery infrastructure. They want help with archiving and perhaps regulatory compliance, but maybe they don't have the budget or the IT infrastructure to be able to build that in-house. These are the people that simply don't want to have edge servers outside their firewall. They want somebody else to do it. Well, guess what? Microsoft can help with that as well. We have something called Exchange Server Hosted Services. And there's 4 different offerings, and these offerings can be purchased together or separately. Some do have dependence on the other. For example, if I buy the archiving, well, I have to have the filtering as well because we're not going to archive a bunch of spam for you. But we do have these different technologies. So Exchange Hosted Filtering is going to give you the antivirus and anti-spam filtering, policy enforcement, disaster recovery. We have multiple antivirus engines that are watching messages that are being addressed to your organization. Essentially, what you're doing for these hosted services is you just point the MX records for your Exchange for your email organization to our servers, and then we will forward the email then to your servers. So that's the hosted filtering. Hosted archive gives you the ability to archive your messages. It gives you search facilities, and it gives you continuity in case you have your own server fails. If your own server fails, well, we'll continue to archive the messages for you and until the time that the server comes back online. And again, you're going to have the benefits of the filtering as well if you buy the archive product. We host something called hosted encryption for you. This is a service that defines rules for you around encrypting messages in transit that are coming from or to your organization. So you can essentially set up a gateway through us using a transport layer security encrypted tunnel. And then your messages can be protected. We also have hosted continuity. And that's just a basic rollback and recovery solution for the sake of continuity of your messages. So we have a 30-day rolling email repository available using the archive store. And then if your internet connection or if your email server fails for any time, well, your users can actually access the repository and they can work with their email until your system is back online. So we host the continuity even for the sake of your end users here. So good option for small and mid-sized businesses that want to offload some of that work. Now, during the session today, we've talked about the only piece of significant user data, and that would be the mailbox database, right? And in the past, our recovery options probably amounted to performing an in-place restore of the mailbox to the original server that homed it, and that's time-consuming. So, and of course, while you're consuming that time, your users are probably unable to get any work done. So Exchange 2007 gives us the ability to make everybody more productive. The first one, database portability. So as we've already seen some of these today in the demonstration, but we finally have the ability to perform a database restore to another working server. It doesn't have to be the original or the originally configured and originally named server. There's nothing in the database object that indicates that what server that database belongs to. And again, if you don't have the time or the intention to recover the entire server, all you need to do is simply restore its mailboxes to another server. So that's that whole notion I talked about. Sit down. You don't have to restore the mailbox server. You can simply recover it and rebuild it essentially if you choose. Now, you're going to use that move mailbox configuration only command, and you'll do that from the Windows or from the Exchange shell, the management shell, and that's updating the Active Directory with the change in the recipient information so that the user, when they connect to their mailbox, Outlook clients, Outlook 2007 clients, Outlook Web Access, are able to find their location of their mailbox. And the second option that on the list here, alternate the server dial tone. We can actually, as we showed earlier, have a separate server, separate mailbox database, and all I need to do is say that the configuration needs to move to another location, and then the users can gain dial tone. So as we did in our first demonstration with Spencer Lowe, right? He had an empty mailbox, but he was able to do his work. And the last one here is the recovery storage group, and that's the one we have yet to demonstrate. Well, this is something that was introduced a little while ago. It was introduced in Exchange Server 2003, and it supported this. That it also supported then for us the dial tone recovery method. So we have the ability to restore our mailbox to the recovery storage group while our users continue to work using a dial tone database in the production database or data store. And then once we had it ready in the recovery storage group, we could actually then recover messages to the dial tone database. Now the problem in 2003 was that this didn't easily recover or didn't easily support recovery of a mailbox database, specifically the mailboxes within a database to another server. That was a problem. So Exchange 2007, we have a recovery storage group functionality actually updated now to support that. We're also supporting filtering or merging mailboxes with the restore mailbox shell commands. If you want to really get do really funky things with restoring of mailboxes and restoring data into mailboxes, do it from the command shell, because the restore mailbox command allows you to do filtering and merging of mail data from one mailbox to another if you choose, or multiple mailboxes to others. Now, there's some additional recovery strategies available to you as well. Let's say you have a server failure, so you're intending to build a new server on new hardware, and you use setup/m recover server command. Well, what is this going to do? It's going to claim the server configuration from Active Directory in order to allow you to build or rebuild the old server. Now, it has an equivalent in 2003, but unlike that 2003 version, this command supports the ability to enable standby clusters. So we can use this command on a cluster, and to do that, we actually use setup/m: recover server and then /recover CMS. So that's the command. Now, there's an important note about this. You can't use this command to rebuild your edge server. Recovery on the edge server is a clean installation, and then that's followed by importing the previously exported edge configuration. Now we have some really handy new utilities in the Exchange toolbox, and I'll show you those in just a second. But we have this one tool called the Database Troubleshooter tool, and it can actually analyze our event logs. It can search for known issues. For example, if we're running out of disk space, if we have log generation causing problems or reaching the database size limit, possible database corruption. And then this other tool is the Database Recovery Management tool. And this is the tool that gives us support for our recovery storage group. It also supports mailbox extraction, and it provides access to database recovery tools such as ESEUtil and ISIntag, or Information Store Integrity tool. We have some enhancements to the database that can help us in our recovery needs. One of those is the fact that we actually support 50 storage groups, and of course, by that implication, 50 databases. Now, it's important to remember, again, recovery and best practices of recovery really indicate that you should limit the number of databases per storage group to 1. And that's because it's far quicker to back up and restore a number of smaller databases than a few larger databases. And also, we need to consider the requirement to restore a single mailbox. That's quicker when the databases are comparatively small, right? So the one-to-one ratio is the recommended method, one mailbox store to one storage group. And it's also a requirement in order to support local continuous replication and clustered continuous replication. What about the log file names? Doggone those log file names, they were too short. We ran out of log file names too often if we didn't do backups regularly. Well, Exchange Server 2003, right, our file names only had 5 characters. Well, Exchange 2007, we've increased the number of log files that can be created by a factor of 2,000, essentially. We allow 8 characters now. And a reminder, log files are the primary mechanism we have for data replay of a storage group. And we've also simplified the data structure, the database structure. We no longer have a separate streaming content file or an STM file for the mailbox and public stores. So that's going to make it easier for you to perform database operations because the database structure is more simple. Now let's take a look at some backup and restore options and backup and restore issues to consider. Now remember the backup methods we have available to us. Exchange Server 2007 does support both volume shadow copy-based backups, VSS-based backups, and the more traditional online streaming backup that NT Backup does for us. Now, of course, the major benefit of VSS backups is the relative speed of data recovery. And there's elements within the VSS framework known as requesters, writers, and providers that communicate to create and restore volume shadow copies. Now, the ability to perform fast restores is dependent on the capabilities of the provider. Now, there is a software provider and a general file system writer that are included with Windows Server 2003. So Windows Backup actually can use the VSS components to perform general file shadow copy backups. But the Exchange Server has some specific backup and restore requirements, and the general file system writer can't handle those. So this is why you need to use third-party provided VSS components in order to backup and restore Exchange if you want to use VSS. We discussed earlier both LCR and CCR. We talked about those earlier in today's session. And remember, if you're keeping these available replicas of storage groups, you're greatly reducing the need to perform so many backup operations. So if in Exchange Server 2003 we told you do regular normal backups, maybe as frequently as daily to protect the database against data loss, well now it's really easy to combine a weekly normal backup and daily incremental backups and have the same, if not better, level of protection against data loss as long as we're using LCR at least. Now the other major issue here is that when you need to perform a restore under Exchange Server 2003, you needed an identically built server on which to restore your database. And as we've seen already, Exchange 2007 supports a restore of a database to any running server. Now we've made some enhancements to VSS service. Let's return to VSS for just a minute here before we do our last demonstration. In Exchange Server 2003, VSS backups supported only a single storage group at a time. So even if we had a third-party tool that did VSS backups, we could only do a single storage group at a time. Well, we've removed that limit in Exchange Server 2007. So now you can do parallel backups, multiple storage groups using a VSS backup method. You can also restore a VSS backup to any path. You don't need to restore back to the original location. That's huge. The VSS system also can verify before the restore takes place whether the database that you're restoring is going to mount successfully after your restoration. So if it has detected that what you're going to restore isn't likely to mount, you're going to get an error before it tries to restore it. And it's going to help you avoid wasting your time attempting a futile restore operation. Now, you also have the option to run recovery when the restore is finished, but the database mount takes an extended period. So you can let the restore finish when the database is mountable. Finally, you can now restore either to the recovery storage group or you can recover to an alternate server. Really, the choice is up to you. Okay, in our last demonstration, I'm going to create the recovery storage group, and we've already actually done the second bullet here. I've already backed up the first storage group using a streaming backup. But I'm going to show you how then to use the recovery storage group and restore data both to the RSG, and then I'm actually going to bring Spencer back up online on his original server with a couple of days old data, but we'll show you how it works. All right, so next sharing slide here, and again we're back to application sharing. So we'll tell you what, let's do this. Let's open up our management tools. Actually, I'll go ahead and close Spencer's mailbox here. We're going to come back to that in a second. And on our server here, and actually a couple of things I want to show you. I'll show you my backup file as well. As I mentioned, I created a streaming backup, so I just created a first storage group.bkf file using the NT backup utility. Okay, and I did this a few days ago. Now let's open up a tool in the toolbox. Remember, we have these tools now for disaster recovery: database recovery management and database troubleshooter. I'm going to open up the database recovery management tool because this is the one that helps us manage these disaster recovery scenarios. So it's a new activity. What do I want to do? Call this. Well, what are we doing? We're creating a recovery storage group, and I've already run this tool once, so it's kept the information I have here. But in this case, our server name, Exchange server name, is there, and our domain controller is here. If we were requiring additional authentication for the sake of doing any Exchange operations, of course, you have to be an Exchange administrator, local administrator, and I could put those credentials here if I wasn't already logged in as that account, or as an account that has those credentials. I'll go ahead and click Next. It's going to check my connectivity to Active Directory and to my Exchange server, and it's reading information from Active Directory. Okay, so here it gives us a number of options of managing databases, managing recovery storage groups, and so on. Take a look at it. We can verify our databases, analyze log drive space, repair a database. So it gives us a real good interface into the very powerful tools. One of those tools here, the ability to create a recovery storage group. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. In fact, I'm going to create this recovery storage group on our server, and I'm going to link it to our first storage group. And then we're going to give this recovery storage group a name. Now, I apologize for some of the graphics here. I noticed the first part of these lines, for some reason, the display of this form actually cuts off the first part of those in this virtual machine here. So you have to take my word for it. I'm actually typing RSG, even though you just see SG. And then we're also going to choose the log path and the storage group path that we want this recovery storage group to use. So I'm going to browse to those. And what I'm going to do is put the recovery storage group ones on disk 2. I have a separate hard disk, another separate hard disk, and I have a DB folder and a log folder there. So I'm going to put the log folders here, log files there, I should say, and I'm going to put the database files, the DB folder, and mailbox database name is fine, mailbox database. Okay, create the recovery storage group. That should go through fairly quickly and build a recovery storage group for us. All right, so now we have this recovery storage group named RSG available to us to restore to. Now, let's do that. Now, before I do that, remember, when we're, again, as I did on our other server, if we're recovering data into a mailbox database, we need to do a couple of things. Now, I need to be able to set the fact that we're allowing our file restore to happen on that mailbox database. So let's do that. Set, and this I'm doing it from the management shell again. Set mailbox database SMBEX01 first storage group mailbox database. I had to specify the storage group now because remember we have another mailbox database by the same name in the recovery storage group. And I'll say allow file restore. And what did I miss? Oh, well, of course I have to say allow file restore false? No, true. There we go. All right, missed one parameter. Okay, so we've done that. Now, remember, I'm also going to be writing into the recovery storage group, because if I'm going to be recovering from backup into the RSG, well, I'm going to make sure that that flag is set there as well. So I'm going to take this command and just edit this a little bit and change first storage group to RSG, the name of our recovery storage group. For this case, it says, well, it completed successfully, but we didn't actually change anything. And why is that? Because that's already set by default. Recovery storage group already has that flag set. So that's just to make that clear to you. Okay. So let's switch back to our backup. Let's open up the backup utility. As I said, I've already created that backup. Now I'm ready to do the restore, and the restore is going to happen to the recovery storage group. I'm going to go into advanced mode for NT backup here. And there's the backup that I created of my first storage group. I'm going to go ahead and select that, start the restore. I need to have a temporary location for the log and patch files. I'm going to just go ahead and use the root of C for that. And this is the one restore set that I'm going to restore, so it will replay the log files after this restore completes. And I'll say OK. All right. Now let's think again. While this actually, let me do this. While this is restoring, let's think about the state of Spencer's mailbox. Spencer's mailbox is currently live on another server. But let's say, for example, that server is now dead. Well, actually, it is dead because I've shut the machine down. So Spencer has no access to that mailbox. I want Spencer to be able to have access back to this original mailbox store. Okay. So what do I need to do? Everybody remember? What was it? Nope, not that one. Move mailbox. And target the database. I have to specify the storage group here this time. Configuration only. All right. So I'm not going to run that command just yet, because what I want to do is, I could actually. Well, you know what? Let's go ahead and do it. Why not? Let's do it. Yes. So we're only repositioning the configuration information. We don't have to actually have that data live yet there in the database, because of course we could come back with dial tone at this point. So that's going to go ahead and complete. Let's go ahead and close our restore, which is already completed. So that's good. That's just going to take a second to bring that configuration information over. There we go. Now, well, I haven't actually recovered his mailbox yet, right? If that mailbox store on the first storage group was empty, well, then he would essentially have dial tone. But at this point, what I would need to do is run one more command. In this case, the commands that would copy the data over. So let's first mount the RSG database, because I actually didn't do that yet. RSG mailbox database. And then let me just see what's in that recovery storage group database. Let me use the get mailbox statistics command. I'm going to format it table. So simple table, one column, just showing me the display names. So it's showing me the mailboxes, the display names for the mailboxes that currently exist in the RSG. Oh, good. Spencer has a mailbox there that I can recover. So let's do that. Restore mailbox. And the RSG database is and I hit enter. It says, wait a minute, you really want to do that? Yeah, I want to do that. And again, depending on how I did the command, I could have cycled through and used a more lengthy command in the command shell here, but it could have cycled through all those mailboxes, very quickly restored each and every one of them if I chose, or based on certain criteria, I could have done that as well in the where object criteria selection. So all the different power we have in the shell in order to be able to do these, what could be very massive restorations. In this case, very simple restoration of one mailbox. So let's verify. Actually, one more verification here. What was that one we did with Spencer? Get mailbox. Just to make sure that his mailbox is now, pointed to the original server, original location. And look at that. Spencer's mailbox restored back to a couple days ago using the power of the recovery storage group, the streamed backup that I performed, and the restoration to the recovery storage group. Yay! All right, so I hope you're as excited as I am about this new technology. We covered a lot of great ways that you can start planning now for disasters and being able to recover using Exchange Server 2007 and using good planning practices. So we talked about each of the server roles in Exchange 2007. We talked about the impact that the failure of any of those roles would have within your organization. We talked about why load balancing, why using clustering. We talked about data replication. So different ways and different things that you can use to protect yourself against server failures. And we also talked about the issues around component failures. We talked and spent some time identifying recommended disconfigurations for the various server roles. We also learned that to prevent a failure from becoming a disaster, you really need to consider and understand the typical problems that you might face. So we examined some possible solutions to those problems. And lastly, we saw that in the event of a failure, Exchange Server 2007 does give you several improved and new mailbox and other recovery tools so that you can get your server up and running as quickly as possible. Here's some more information for you if you need to do some additional looking up of information here. Certainly TechNet is the first and best place to go as an IT professional for information about Microsoft products for your needs. I have a link here to this session's resource page, so the content team has a page with links to related resources there. I am a member of a team that does live events all over the United States, the TechNet team and Microsoft Across America team. And so if you want to find out where we're going to be upcoming couple months here, please go to technetevents.com and you'll be able to see our schedule and see where I'm going to be coming to a town near you to do a live and free event. I have a blog, as I mentioned earlier, full of IT. That's how it's pronounced. And it's at that address, as well as that permalink that I promised you up at the top of the webcast here for that resource page that I put together for you there. And my email address also available to you as a last resort. If you can't find the answer online, go ahead and send me an email, kevin.remdy@microsoft.com. I want to take an opportunity to thank you very much for attending the webcast today. We've come up almost right to the top of the hour, so amazing timing on this webcast. But I do want to have a little time for question and answer. So if you haven't had a chance yet to submit a question, please do. I'm going to take a look at the queue now while I hand it over to Sarah for just a minute here, and then we'll see if we can answer some of your questions here on the live webcast.
All right, thanks so much, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, we will be doing a quick question and answer session. It looks like we've already got a couple in there. So if you have any other questions for Kevin, go ahead and type those in now, and he'll be reading them out loud and answering them out loud for everyone's convenience. Also, to print a copy of today's PowerPoint, just simply go up to File and click Print to PDF. And to view a replay of today's live event or to register for upcoming webcasts, visit microsoft.com/webcast. While you're typing in questions for him, I'm also going to be putting this survey up there for you to fill out. Your feedback and comments help us create better webcasts for you. So give Kevin the great review and comments that he deserves. And while you're filling out the survey, be typing in some questions for him, and he'll be answering them in just a moment. Kevin, back over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, we do really appreciate your evaluation on the webcast, and thank you very much for doing that for us. Okay, so Keith asks, must all Exchange 2007 servers be 64-bit, no matter what the role? Yeah, the answer is to that question is yes. Is this available now? All the stuff we talked about today available now, or do we have to wait for SP1? What about replication? And when is SP1 due to release? I don't know the details on the specifics. I don't think those have been released yet on the availability of Service Pack 1. Certainly watch my blog. I'll post it as soon as I hear it, so you can hear it from me first if you choose. But I don't know the actual release date. I know that we are running it in beta right now. In fact, internally, many of us are running it on for our own mailboxes, and I've got a very large mailbox and all sorts of new functionality in Outlook Web Access that I don't have time to get into right now. But it's pretty cool. But anyway, yeah, it is coming. We'll just say soon. Okay. Will you cover standby continuous replication? Well, I'm not sure what you mean by standby continuous replication, and yeah, we didn't really cover that. Because I wonder if you're referring to single copy clustering, or are you referring to? And maybe you can clarify for me, Gene, whether you're referring to single copy clustering or LCR or CCR. What is the best method of recovering a single email if the user deleted it from his mailbox? Well, the easiest way is to understand that if they simply hit the delete key, it's in their deleted items. Now, if they cleared their deleted items folder, then it's typically still available to them for a certain period. And you have, as administrators, the ability to say what that period of time is where it's still available to them. And they actually have the ability in Outlook. You can go in and you can recover deleted items, and those things will actually be available. Now, if you have done a shift to delete, well, then you're prompted for, are you sure you want to delete these forever? And those won't be available for in that case. So you do have the ability to, as a user, delete things permanently, but typically you'll have that amount of time where you can recover something. So that is the first and best line of defense against that. Next best method, I guess, if it wasn't available, if they realize maybe months later that they had an email, and if you've been doing your job about, and again, it all depends on your company's policies, but if you have a good archival policy in place and a good rotation of offline media and off-site media, being able to recover that media probably to a recovery storage group, and if you find the proper date that has that mail, if you know approximate date for that, being able to restore that mailbox to the recovery storage group and then use the tools in order to recover that data into the user's mailbox, but not right over the top of their mail. You would recover it into a subfolder, and that's one of the options that you have to, when you recover, so that they can then go through those and find that. Now, you do have options also of filtering on items within. So from the Exchange Management shell, you can actually recover just certain emails or emails with certain items in them or something that's identifiable and recover those either into the user's mailbox, into somebody else's mailbox, whatever you have access to as an administrator. So you have a lot of options there and a lot of power there in the management shell. That's also the place where you'll do, for example, if you have regulatory needs and compliance where someone comes to you and says, well, hey, we need to do discovery on this. Can you please put emails from this particular person or people all into this other folder for me, a copy of those so that we can go through those and do discovery and search on it and all that. A lot of power from the management shell. Do you have to create a recovery storage group in order to restore Exchange 2007? No. You saw what I did. I could actually, if I had a copy of the database, or I could actually recover using Volume Shadow Service Restore. I can restore a backup to any location, and essentially I can mount that database. I mean, it's very easy to do because there's nothing about the server or the location of the database that's contained within the database itself. So no, I mean, Recovery Storage Group is still there for you. It's still a good option if you want to do a dial tone restore and you only have one server. And you have the live database that everybody's using as dial tone, and then you recover to the Recovery Storage Group, and then you move their data back into their now live empty database mailboxes, but then bring it back online for them. So Recovery Storage Group is still useful. It still has its uses, but as you've seen in the demonstrations we did today, it's not as necessary a tool as it has been in versions past. Well, I have 5 minutes after the top of the hour, so I'll tell you what, let's wrap up the webcast here. That's the end of the questions in the queue here. If you have any real pressing questions, I'll be happy to stick around for a couple more minutes just in the question manager. But otherwise, I want to tell you all, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much for joining us, and I sincerely hope that you found something useful in this webcast today. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks so much, Kevin, for the great webcast, and thanks to everyone for spending their afternoon with us. Have a great 3-day weekend and a great rest of the afternoon. That concludes the audio portion of this webcast.